I'm so excited to have my friend Melissa Brownback here. We're going to do a little bit of just an interview Q&A. Some of it, there might be a little bit of overlap with what is in the appendix of the book. Melissa wrote the appendix of the book, which is just, I think, a really helpful tool. But I think, some of it might be new and different conversation compared to what's in there. So anyway, welcome, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy launch day. I'm
Thank
so excited
you.
for
I
you.
I am excited too. It's funny, like, people have said like, "Oh, how do how does it feel?" or whatever. And
Uh-huh.
the actual launch day is a little bit anticlimactic, like not in a bad way, but it's just like, okay, it's out. Like you just kind of gotta wait for people to read it. And but
Good.
like I was frantically like cleaning up Hot Wheels cars behind me before this. So that's the glamorous launch day stuff. All right. Well, first of all, Melissa, before we kind of dive into some of the questions, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what do you do, all that good stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a licensed therapist. I've been a therapist for about 10 years and I live in Southern California, but I'm originally from Illinois. So I feel like even though I live on the West Coast, I always feel like I need to say like I'm a Midwestern girl at heart. That's like where I come from.
Yes.
Those are my roots. So I do love living here though. It's like it's very magical. But so I own a private practice here, and just in the past year, I've expanded into a group. So I was solo, and now I have another therapist working with me. And so I would say, as far as my style goes, so I've worked primarily in Christian spheres the past 10 years. So working with people who are wanting to kind of understand how their mental health and their faith can make sense together, and including their faith in their healing process. So I work a lot with women. I also consider myself trauma informed. So I work a lot in that sphere as well with survivors of all types of trauma and abuse in their histories. And also more recently, in the past few years, I've started working more with people that are just dealing with spiritual issues or kind of faith deconstruction or church stuff, church hurt, I feel like has come into my office a lot more in the past few
Hmm.
years. So, and in addition to that, I also am a writer as well. I try to write in the margins of my life, which sometimes I feel like just isn't a lot between
Yes.
work and being a mom. And I have
Yeah.
two kids that are 7 and 9. So, try to do a little bit of that in the margins where I can.
Yeah. I get that. And you're also, did you mention this and I missed it, but your husband is
Mm.
pastor as well. So
Yeah,
just
yeah. My husband's
you're
the lead
in it
pastor. Yeah.
with church
Hmm.
ministry too. So you've got
Yes.
kind of,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but you've got a unique perspective, not just as a therapist, but
Hmm.
somebody who, I realize it's your husband that's on staff, but still, I mean, you are roped into
Yeah.
that ministry
Hmm.
life kind of by default too. Which is why I think it's so helpful to talk to you because, you get a little bit of both the pastoral perspective as well as the
Totally.
therapy perspective, which is really
Hmm.
helpful. So, um, all right. So one thing I want to address and just help people, and you've posted a little bit about this on Instagram. I was kind of looking at some of your old
Hmm.
Instagram posts the other night. And one of the things that I get a lot when I start talking about rest or weariness and that topic is people respond with this sort of like desperation, like, oh my gosh, I
Hmm.
need some rest or I could use some rest. And it's almost like just this acknowledgement of like, I know this is a thing I'm not getting and I'm just at the end of my rope. And I think so many people are just flat out burned out. Right. And like many of us
Hmm.
are tired. In the book, I write a lot about like sort of a spiritual weariness and a lot of that. But I think there's a lot of physical burnout as well. But I want to get really practical with you because this is also something I don't do quite as much in the book. I'm really talking about a lot of these spiritual battles, but with you, I want to get really practical. What are some of these signs and symptoms of burnout specifically? Because I think that's something that many times we don't realize we're burned out until we're almost like past the point of burnout. But what are some of those
Hmm.
ways that we can recognize we're moving towards burnout? And then kind of after that, what are some real small steps that we can take to move from burnout to being in a place of more rest? Because I feel like
Yeah.
for people who are already burned out, figuring out how to rest can almost feel
Hmm.
more overwhelming than like just continuing to barrel through at the pace that they've been going. Do you know what I mean? Like it can almost
Absolutely.
feel like
Hmm.
rest is sort of an unknown for a lot of people, but continuing doing life with the busyness is almost like feels safer sometimes. So
Yeah.
how can we understand burnout better in our own lives?
So I think probably some of the surface symptoms that I think you'll see a lot, I think probably that some of the low hanging fruit would be definitely that fatigue. And I think it does extend beyond just physical fatigue. Maybe you feel like there's, physical fatigue or emotional fatigue, just kind of feeling like the things that you're feeling feel like too much. There can be relational fatigue of just feeling like I don't feel like I have anything to give to anyone. And there could also be, sensory fatigue. I think a lot
Yeah.
of, young moms experience that for sure. And also, I'd say, struggles with anxiety and depression. Like if you're finding yourself really, really persistently anxious or really persistently heavy, I think those are ways that our body's trying to communicate to us, like that it needs to be tended to and that we need to kind of focus on some of the things that it needs. The other thing I would say is if you have a desire to just completely run away from your life, like
Mm,
if there's this desire of like, I wish that I could just disappear. I wish that I could go away somewhere. I've even heard some people say like, I actually wouldn't mind like having an accident or a surgery or something just so I can get some rest. So if you find yourself saying those types of things, you're definitely probably already burnt out. And then one of the things we talk about with burnout in the mental health, like the helper field, is compassion fatigue. So if you start
okay.
feeling like you're getting really irritated with people that you would normally feel like you can have, compassion or empathy for, but if everything is bothering you or if you feel like you just don't care about other people anymore, that can be a sign that you're really burnt out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So man, I feel like as far as moving through burnout, it's difficult because I would say there's probably not a one size fits all approach to it. So I was thinking about, how do you take this idea and maybe individually tailor it to your own specific needs? But one of the things I was thinking about too is that I really feel like maybe it's just our culture or part of our culture too, but this idea of like if you're feeling tired or if you're feeling burnt out, there's so much pressure, I think, just to keep your head down and keep pushing through.
Mhm.
And maybe that's because, a lot of times we can't escape the season that we're in. Like if you
Right.
have a newborn, like you can't really just stop being a parent. If you
Right.
have different seasons, if you have a special needs child, like you can't get away from that. So I think, first of all, just the first step of just naming it and saying, this is where I am is a
Mhm.
huge step. And also thinking about what does moving through burnout look for me in this specific season that I'm in. So for example, like if you do have, young kids, it may not look like you can go, take a 3-day trip by yourself, like things that
Yeah.
you might hear are, ways to deal with burnout, just thinking about what does rest look like for me in the season that I'm in. And I think a really practical place to start, and a lot of place where when people are really kind of already burnt out, even when I'm working with my clients, one of the ways that I like to start with them is just experiencing some goodness in their body. So I feel like
Okay.
that's a really basic place to start. So I kind of have people come up with like if you could make up like a sensory toolkit. I even, some of my more like severe like trauma clients, they even have like a to-go version that they'll like put in a
Okay.
bag, but just like so thinking of, something that you like to listen to, something that has like a tactile feel that feels comforting, something that you like to smell, something that you like to taste, something that you like to look at. So sometimes even just little bits of those things can bring just a bit of rest or goodness. Cause I feel like there are times where it's like you kind of have to take the bits and pieces that you can get before you might have like a more
Yeah.
extended, like maybe you could get a half a day away or something like that. But
Yeah.
just being able to get rest in those moments, I think can be really helpful. And then the other thing too is thinking about, I feel like also when it comes to self-care, there's a lot of shoulds.
Mm.
And so even when we come into that space, we can also not always be thinking about what we need, but what everybody else tells us self-care should look like. So we get
Yeah.
some time to ourselves and we're like, okay, I need to be reading, I need to be working on myself, I need to be journaling, I need to be, I need to be doing all of these things. And I don't know if you're familiar with Kendra Adachi. She
Mhm.
is okay. So she like hosts the Lazy Genius podcast, but she has this had this definition of self care of just like doing something that makes you feel like yourself.
Mhm.
And I really love that. And I know it sounds really simple, but just this idea of if something is going to make you feel like yourself, even if it's not something that you feel like is ultimately, making you grow or, something for your mental health, but just really this idea of, letting yourself experience goodness, letting yourself experience, even pleasure of just like having a good feeling inside of yourself, inside of your body. And also, sometimes too, I think just we need community, I think, to help us with
Yeah.
self-care. And I live super far away from family. So I think too, just me owning the reality that, so like sometimes I have to pay for people to be a part of my village and
Yeah.
in order to get what you need. So yeah, so those are just like a few practical things. But I think if you're looking for a baseline place to start, that anything sensory is really can be super, super helpful to
That's really
even break up your day.
I think that's super helpful, and I think my mentality a lot of times is I'm very all or nothing, so it's
Mm,
like, okay, if I can't go do the big thing or take the vacation or whatever, then I just need to, like, barrel through, and I think sometimes we forget that, like, we can experience what might seem like very small moments of rest, but that actually over time especially can make such a huge difference in helping us, like you
mhm.
said, just feel more like a person, and feel more like ourselves. And I think sometimes we can easily, at least I can easily dismiss some of those smaller actions and kind of forget that, okay, I might only have 3 minutes, but how can I in these
Mhm.
3 minutes sort of like settle my body and kind of start and feel like myself a little bit rather than just mindlessly running to the next thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's really helpful.
And I think we do oftentimes like I'm so guilty of this too, like using those spaces, like I'm going to scroll on my phone, and
Hmm.
just, but I feel like I've just become aware of the more that I do that, I'm so dissatisfied when I'm done. And I was like,
Yes.
what was that even for? And I don't feel rested. I don't feel better. But if I did maybe just take a minute to, even do something like eat a little snack that I like and just like
Right.
mindfully eat and really pay attention to like this little like square of dark chocolate or
Yeah.
something that I'm eating, like you will walk away feeling more restored from that 3 minutes than
Yes. That's
you
so
would by
good.
just like mindlessly scrolling on your phone.
A couple weeks ago, I it was just one of those moments in my house that was just complete, and utter chaos. Like the
Mhm.
kids were fighting and I was like, I've got to get out of this house. And it was, right after dinner. And so we thankfully needed some groceries. I was like, I'm going to go to the grocery store. My husband was home. And so I went out to the grocery store and I'm like, I'm just going to sit in the parking lot for 3 minutes by
Mhm,
myself.
mhm.
Well, what's the first thing I did is I pulled out my phone. Like I sat and I was like, okay, I could have had these 3 minutes of just, I mean, what I probably needed to do in that moment for me was literally breathe and like calm my body
Mhm,
down.
mhm.
And yet my instinct was just to fill my mind with still like more noise,
Mhm.
and I think some of those, obviously this is not like I'm not anti-technology or anything like that,
Totally.
but I think sometimes we can fill every one of those tiny moments with some form of noise. And I use noise not just in like the audible
Mhm.
noise, but some kind of something that we then never have a chance to sort of allow our bodies and our minds to kind of come down. And I think then, at least for me, then when a lot of times when I get to the end of the day and I'm trying to put my head on my pillow, then everything comes flooding in that I haven't had time to process or to think through, or
Mhm.
to, then I'm laying in my bed staring at the ceiling, trying to, you know, like just
Yeah.
recall all the
Totally.
events of the day and the to-do lists and whatever, because that's the only sort of white space I've had in my day.
Mhm, mhm.
But I think when we, I feel like, at least for me, when I've been able to kind of in like acknowledge and take advantage of even those really small moments, that really does make a difference in the way that I
Yeah.
function and sort of fight that burnout. But
Yeah, and I do think technology is kind of burning us out, especially if you
yeah,
run more empathic or sensitive.
yeah, yeah,
Because I also feel like sometimes I'll open it up and then I'll end up finding, I'm looking at someone's story or like a heavy
Yeah.
part of somebody's life that I'm like, I'm already like,
Yeah.
I'm already having a hard day. Now I'm carrying somebody else's pain. And I also carry people's pain for a living. So
Yeah.
I really feel like just trying to, guard our hearts about what we're taking in, because there are times where I feel like the stuff that I'm carrying, I'm like, what if this is even mine? And what's it
Yeah.
just stuff that I've consumed,
Yeah.
throughout the day from other
Yeah.
people's stories. And yeah, so I feel that heavier and heavier
Yeah, and I
lately.
think we can't, and it's like when we do want to kind of carry other people's stories and other people's burdens, and when we do need to do that, it's like, how can we do that if we're already burnt out? Like
Hmm.
we have to be people who are finding that rest if we're actually going to be
Yeah.
helpful to anybody else, I think. That's so good. Um, I want to move into talking a little bit more about trauma, kind of in the capital T trauma sense. And I want to give a quick caveat as we continue our conversation. I forgot to say this at the beginning, but I am obviously not a mental health professional or a doctor. Melissa is a mental health professional. But I just want to remind everybody, I'm sure this goes without saying, but I want to say it overtly, that anything here is for informational purposes only. And this does not replace any advice of a doctor or a therapist who can speak directly into your situation. Melissa obviously is an expert, but she also does not, know people watching this personally and can't necessarily speak into their personal situation. So with that caveat,
Right.
um, burnout, I think, is something that everybody has experienced, but then I want to talk
Hmm.
about trauma, which may or may not be something that people have experienced. But can you help us understand what is trauma sort of in the clinical sense, like capital T trauma, and
Hmm.
how is that different, or is it different from experiencing like profound grief? Can you help us just understand the difference
Yeah,
between
totally.
grief and trauma?
So I think there's definitely different camps of people out there when it comes to trauma. And I am definitely more in the camp of, I am very comfortable with saying that I think everybody has experienced some type of trauma. And I know you were talking a little bit about kind of big T trauma. So I'm going to unpack like a couple of
Yeah.
ideas. But as far as a basic working definition of trauma is, that trauma is essentially it's a painful experience that we've gone through that gets stuck in our bodies. So it's like a painful
Okay.
experience that we've gone through and we don't have the resources to work it through all the way. So there's a really big continuum of what that can look like. So in the field, when we're talking about big T traumas, those would be the things that might typically be diagnosed as a post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you've experienced like a life-threatening event, or if you've experienced a sexual assault or combat trauma, things like that, you might get a diagnosis for PTSD. And then there's this other concept, which is called small T trauma. And even though it has a small T, it doesn't mean that it's a small impact. So that could be, things that fall in the realm of like an attachment trauma, like maybe you had, parents that were not able to really like attune to your needs fully, either, physically or emotionally. There's experiences like if you've experienced bullying, if you've experienced, racial microaggressions, like there's so many experiences in life, whether it be one time or if you've experienced small T trauma repeatedly, you may have heard of the term complex trauma or complex PTSD. And that is not, it's not recognized as an official diagnosis at this point. There have been some groups that have been working to get it recognized as a diagnosis, but kind of the idea of that is an exposure to a repeated small T trauma throughout your life,
Okay.
which can end up having, a lot of symptoms that look like PTSD when that grows and builds over
Okay.
time. But yeah, but just this idea of anything can
Yeah.
get stuck inside of us from, I think I don't necessarily want to quantify, but just I think of things, that would be smaller on the spectrum. Like maybe there was a single incident of, you public speaking and it going really poorly. And that even an experience like that could really impact you all the way up to things that you might more classify as a more severe trauma.
Okay.
And so the core of trauma is that it's part what happens to us and part how we process it. So there are also times where people are able to process through things because they, get into therapy or they talk through it. And so they actually don't hold on to that thing as a trauma. So you may talk to a person and think like, wow, you've been through a lot. How is that not really affecting you? And there are some people that they don't process things as trauma. So there's kind of two pieces of that puzzle, but I know there's a lot of people out there that are, and I think maybe even sometimes and I'd say a little bit more in the church that seem kind of wary of embracing that trauma language
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to say like, really, like, can we call everything trauma, or does that take away from people who have experienced more severe trauma? And like I said too, I think that there, when you think of God or think of Jesus and his resources, like there's an infinite amount of compassion for every
Yeah.
wound and every pain. And because of that, I think every person's story matters and how that impacts you matters.
Yeah.
And if you experience that as a trauma, then I think that is an okay thing to validate. And I think everybody has pieces of that. Um, so
That's so
yeah.
helpful because I think we can easily get into the comparison game of,
Hmm.
if we have not experienced, a severe capital T trauma necessarily, I think we can easily sometimes say, well, like I see this person going through this. Mine's not as bad as that. Like I just need to buck up and get over it,
Right.
and then we don't get the help that we need, or
Hmm.
we don't even like name what we're going through. And obviously we have to have perspective, right? Like
Yeah,
if
totally.
I break my leg, that's not as severe as, like somebody dying. Like there is,
Mhm, mhm.
however, that comparison game I think can either keep us from
Baby,
getting
I'm
the
just
help that we
running.
need, or it can keep us from having compassion for other people.
Mhm,
If we are on the side where maybe our trauma is worse in a sense, I
mhm.
use that term like kind of in quotes, then I think
Totally.
we can also fail to have compassion for people that were like, well, they have no right to complain. Like that
Yeah.
comparison really hamstrings our ability to be compassionate, I
Mhm.
think. But
Yeah. And man, and I think your question about grief, I think it's really complex because I do think grief is a big part of trauma work, because I think there's this idea of, needing to grieve the loss of expectations, needing to grieve the loss of the things that we don't have. I think that's a really big part of it. But I also think that there are experiences of grief that aren't necessarily
mhm,
trauma as well. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and I think that one of the ways that I think that you can kind of tell if that grief is related to trauma is, if you're going through, some sort of major transition in your life and you feel like there's all these experiences that are coming to the surface that seem to come out of nowhere. So
yeah,
I think for me in particular, and probably for a lot of women, but I think that came up a lot for me when having my first child.
mhm,
And I had to really face a lot of grief from my own story. You know, a tiny little piece of my story is that I don't have the closest relationship with my mom, and my parents split up when I was really young, and I was primarily raised by my dad. And so I think there was a lot riding on me coming into this role of being a mom. And so there were
yeah,
a lot of feelings that surfaced, even as different things in my life happened, like as my kids reached those ages,
mm,
I noticed that those were times where just emotionally I was struggling more, and I
yeah,
had just stuff I needed to work through and stuff I needed to work on during those seasons, and really needed to be just very kind to myself as I walked through those phases. So yeah, so if there's this idea that, I'm experiencing a reaction that feels totally out of the blue,
mhm,
there's a good chance that might be actually connected back into some painful memories from your past. Maybe you're aware of it, or maybe that thing is not on the forefront of your
yeah,
memory. But it's kind of this idea of your body remembering the way something feels. And so therapy can also be a great place to try to unpack some of that and
yeah,
understand it.
yeah. That's so helpful. Yeah, really, really helpful. Okay. So I also want to say too, I know that there's a few of you on here live. If you have any questions as we're talking about certain things, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got the chat open and I'm happy to ask those to Melissa as we're talking. So if there's anything
Yeah.
related, and then at the end as well, if you've got any questions, we can definitely ask those. So Okay, so we talked about you're a therapist and also a pastor's wife, and you do have this helpful perspective between faith, the relationship between faith and mental health. So in your experience and just as a professional and as somebody in ministry, what do you wish that the church did better
Mm.
when it comes to mental health? Or on the positive side, like what have you seen churches do well when it comes to topics related to mental health?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to start with like the good news or the bad news, but maybe I'll start with the bad news. But I think that some of the things that I have observed being the most painful for people, I would say probably far and away the most common thing would be spiritual bypassing. So if you're
Mm,
unfamiliar with that term, kind of the idea is like it's using maybe like a Christian platitude or a Bible verse to kind of bypass or move over somebody else's pain so that you're not actually sitting with them in their pain. And so for example, it's like if somebody is having I feel like I'm using a lot of mom examples maybe too because of knowing there's a lot of parenting stuff in your book, Sarah. But this idea of like if you're just having a really, really hard day as a mom and you're just like, I feel so burnt out or I feel so exhausted or I feel like I can't do it anymore. And then somebody comes up to you and you're like, and they say something like, well, like the days are long and the years are short,
yeah. Yeah.
just like you're gonna miss this kind of thing. That's not really spiritual in nature, but this idea of like children are a blessing and
Right.
all of these things. And so I think that there's this idea of, if you say stuff like that or just like, oh, just pray about it and like God's gonna take that thing away from you. That has been, I would say, something that a lot of people would say that they've experienced from other Christians as being
Mm,
really hurtful, and that people just feel missed and that
right.
we are not always good at being with each other in
Yeah.
our pain. And I even think of like, when's the last time you went to a worship service and there was a song that was like a lament song
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
just like
Yep.
really just digging out like the deep dark emotions of the human experience. Like we don't really do that very often, or if we do, we don't really spend a lot of time we don't spend a lot
Yeah.
of time there. And so I think sometimes if you're walking through something hard, you can be like looking around yourself at church and there's all these people like with their hands raised and they seem so joyful and you're like, what is wrong with me,
Yeah.
because I do not feel like I'm in this place. So yeah, so I think spiritual bypassing and really like working in the language of lament and the language of
Yeah.
just dark and heavy emotions as just a normal part of the human experience, I think would be super helpful.
That's good.
Um, but man, as far as the positives, I really do feel like there are a lot of churches out there that are really taking to heart a lot of things with mental health. So, even by including, series on relationship, like we just finished a series on relationships and we were able to pull in, stuff from scripture and research from John Gottman and, this
Yeah.
idea that we can, talk about relationships and include the things that we know to be true that have been researched that are, shown in science, and that can be something that can actually bolster our relationships and our faith. So I think that's great, and super helpful when churches are willing to do that. And there's so many churches that like they do a great job of having, a referral list of
Yeah.
licensed therapists. There are churches that have, lay counselors and people that are there to listen and support, and prayer teams and all of those things I think are super great
If I
resources. Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
jump in on that really quick? And you do talk about this a little bit in the appendix, but
Oh
can
yeah.
you, um, when you're talking about, referral list versus lay
Hmm.
counselors versus pastoral counselors, how can we help understand when it might be time to, pastoral counseling, I think can be such a beautiful and helpful
Hmm.
resource and just definitely a work that the church should be doing.
Yeah.
But when can we kind of know, like, okay, I actually need a clinical, a licensed clinical therapist? How do
Hmm.
we know who to go to for what?
Yeah, totally. So I think that where the church and lay counselors can do a really great job, I would say there's probably a few different I'm thinking like 3 different areas. So I would say if there was like a really specific type of goal, so like something that's short term and goal oriented. So I would
Okay.
say a good example of that would be premarital counseling,
Okay.
where you're going for, 6 to 8 sessions with a pastor and working through different issues. I would say seeing a professional is also really helpful for premarital
Yeah.
to really dig into some
Yes.
deeper issues, but that could be an example of a great space for that. Also, I think that churches are really great for what I would almost call like a triage type of
Okay.
situation. So if you just found out that your spouse is having an affair, or you just lost, a family member, and so you're in the thick of it, and it's like that, those first couple of calls, like you may not
Mhm.
be able to get into a professional right away, but just somebody that's going to help you kind of move through in a short-term crisis,
Okay.
with the idea that you're going to get referred
Okay.
out. And then I also think, any situation, like if you're really wanting to understand things from a spiritual perspective. So if you're thinking like, I really want to understand, like, what does the Bible have to say about depression or
Yeah.
anxiety? And I really want to like dig deep into learning about that, and how can I understand that better? I think pastoral counseling is great for that as well. Um, but I'd say there's definitely a line where, because I would say just most pastors, they just don't really have the training. And I know
Yeah.
my husband has an MDiv, and I think he had to take one counseling class. So it's
Yeah.
great. Like he took
Yeah.
one, but he will tell you too, he's like, and I think there's also probably pastors with different personalities. Like there's some that really
Yeah.
love doing that stuff. And my husband's like, I know that's not my thing. Like he meets with people a lot, and he'll do
Yeah.
premarital counseling, but he knows his limitations pretty well, and what
Yeah.
he, feels energized by. So I think he has a lot more of a tendency to refer out. But yeah, but a couple things I would say is like if somebody I think especially like, I feel like sometimes this goes without saying, but I feel like it's still important to say it, that especially if someone's dealing with suicidal thoughts,
Mm.
if someone is dealing with like self-harm or an eating disorder, an addiction,
Yeah.
or substance abuse, if somebody is dealing with any sort of an abuse type situation in their home, if someone is expressing like really severe trauma to you, or anxiety, and if you're noticing yourself as the helper
Yeah.
feeling anxious, burnt out, if you're starting to have compassion fatigue or feeling out of your depth, I think those are all important areas to refer out. And honestly too, I think that no we all need a network of support
Yeah.
anyway. And also, so if you're feeling kind of like you're the only one that
Yeah.
person is talking to, I don't think anybody should be anyone's only one. Like I
Yeah.
don't think any of us have the
Yeah.
capacity to do that well. And so I think it's also great to refer out if you feel like that person doesn't really have a support network outside of you, because it's really not enough, because
Yeah.
you will end up being the first call all the time, and I don't
Yeah.
think any of us can really sustain that.
That's really helpful. And I think it leads right into my next question, which is, I think we want to be able to show compassion to people, right? And we want to be able to be compassionate to those who are hurting. And so helping people maybe by referring them to professionals or whatever. But what are
Mhm.
some of the other ways that we can just support and show compassion and love others in our life who are going through something? And I think especially when we have not experienced that particular thing. Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
think sometimes it can be really, really challenging to help or to encourage somebody who's struggling with severe anxiety when maybe we're not a person that understands
Mhm.
what that physiologically feels like when we've never dealt with sort of that crippling physiological anxiety. How can we better support others who are hurting, especially when we've never experienced those things?
Yeah, I think that, there's also probably maybe 2 types of people that in that camp of that I haven't experienced that type of thing. So there are some where you might say, I haven't experienced that and I really, really want to help you, but I don't know how. And then other people who might think, I haven't experienced it, I don't get it, and I feel kind of frustrated with this
Yeah,
person
yeah,
who's experiencing it because I just don't get it. So
yeah,
but I think honestly, either way, I think one of the best things to do in terms of your own personal reflection is I always think if you don't have compassion for someone, regardless of if you desire to or whatever you feel about it, is that the best place to start is internally, because I think that the best bridge for compassion is when you have a really good understanding and compassion for yourself and your own struggles. So I think
Yeah.
there's a sense of, if you don't know what it is to have anxiety, we all know what it is to struggle in some
Yeah.
way, and we all have had experiences where, there are parts of ourselves that we just feel like are really stuck, and
Yeah.
no matter what we do, like, there's this thing that's still with us. And so I think that by and also by us showing compassion and empathy to those parts of ourselves and being like,
Mhm.
okay, because I think also, what I was even going back to the spiritual bypassing thing is, honestly, I think the main reason why we do that is because we have a hard time holding the reality of
Yeah.
suffering, because we have a hard time holding it inside of ourselves. Like, it's not really about the other person, but it's more of like,
Yeah.
I don't really want to think about that right now. I don't really want to deal with the reality that there's so much pain in
Yeah.
this world, or maybe that there's pain inside of me that I'm not paying attention to. So
Yeah.
so I think starting with yourself, and that's also a place where whatever you then decide to do out of that place, you're doing it in connection to yourself, because I think a lot of people will also really fall into like a kind of pleasing, or
Yeah.
at best, and maybe even like codependent at worst types of
Yeah.
behaviors, because they are, just they feel like it's their job to like fix or heal the other person. And so I think just staying connected to yourself is really helpful. Um, and then I also think there's some practical things too. I'd say just asking a lot of questions. If you
Mm.
don't understand, just being able to ask open-ended questions of like, help me understand that, or what's that like for you, or what does
Mm.
anxiety feel like to you, or what is depression? How do you experience that? I'd really like to know. And I think that people, are usually willing to talk more about that. And so you're just
Yeah.
trying to understand where they're coming from, and being able to show them empathy of like saying stuff like, man, that sounds really hard. Or,
Yeah.
just I could imagine that that's really difficult to hold given all the other stuff that you do in your life. And I think those are,
Yeah.
so asking really good questions, being really curious about other
Yeah.
people, is super helpful. And I'd say, I think I mentioned this in the appendix too, but I think a couple of practical things, and this is even stuff that I've seen people do with my clients. And when people in their lives do this, I just feel so happy to see that they have a good supportive community outside of therapy. But
Mhm.
sometimes I'll like recommend my client read a book, and they're like, I mentioned it to one of my friends and she's going to read it with me.
That's so
And we're going to
awesome.
go out to coffee once a week and read this book, or, and process what we're learning. And she didn't go through what I went through. She just wants to
Yeah.
read it with me so she can just be a support to me. So I love that. And I also think, I mean, I feel like this is, also super practical, but just showing up in really practical ways of like, can I watch your kids? Can I bring you a meal? Can I get you a coffee, or can I get takeout for you? Like, if you don't like to cook or whatever, but just practical ways. Cause I think when people are suffering internally, it's so hard because it feels like there's nothing we can do. But
Yeah.
sometimes those practical things of like, when you're already struggling emotionally, sometimes like thinking about like, what am I going to feed myself and my
Yeah.
family is just
Yeah.
like one extra weight, that if somebody just showed up and was like, hey, here's some food. And
Yeah.
they also may not be able to ask
Yeah.
all the time when you're really, really struggling emotionally. So, man, I think those can be some really practical ways, just to
That's
step in and
yeah.
care.
That's so good. I wanna this question, that Karen just messaged in the chat kind of piggybacks on this, so I wanna just jump in and ask, her question. She said, "What are some strategies for helping a spouse or a friend with their mental health
Mm,
crisis without feeling weighed down by it in a season of overwhelm yourself?" So we've been talking about how to support others, but when you yourself are kind of already starting from a place of
mhm.
overwhelm, she's feeling overwhelmed as a mom with three tiny kids, married to a spouse who has clinical depression, but is weaning off medicine. It feels like their needs are so much bigger, and it's easy to neglect my own while wanting to be a supportive spouse. What are some ways, when you've got somebody in your life
Yeah.
really struggling, but you yourself are just maxed out? I mean, just even
Mhm.
even from your own needs that are profound, or just from, normal life is is enough to carry on its own. How can
Oh my
you
gosh.
how can you
Yeah.
support people especially someone really close to you, like a spouse or a child?
Yeah, I think that's so tough because, I feel like our capacity also for supporting others shifts as our like internal world shift as well. And so it seems like there's, for you specifically, just a lot of demands on your time just in life. And then also, walking alongside someone and having that be your spouse is even different from having that be a friend because
Hmm.
it's this idea of, you actually like live with this person and you're,
Yeah.
you're with them every single day. But so I do think it's one of those things where it kind of even again like our conversation about seasons of like if you have small children, like you're not going to magically pop out of that season, and if
Right.
somebody's going through a long term mental health issue, you're not going to be able to magically pop out of that season either. But I think about a few things would be if you have the resources, I think both both people being in individual counseling can be really helpful because again it's that whole idea of you want to be that person's support but you can't be everything, and
Hmm.
acknowledging your limitations means acknowledging like I don't have the capacity
Yeah.
right now to be able to handle this and to be able to all the way. And I think even with friends, I think of some of my friendships as well where I have a friend that has a kid with special needs, and so sometimes she's able to be present, and then sometimes she just needs to really kind of tend to the needs of her family. And
Hmm.
so I think that when you have kind of that understanding and with a relationship of just being able to check in with each other and even say like, hey, I love you and I'm here for you and I'm committed to this relationship, but my capacity is diminished, so as a result of that, like I'm going to need you to bring that into your support community or bring that into your own therapy right now because I feel like I just don't have the
Yeah.
capacity to hold it all. And I think that can be really difficult for people to hear sometimes. It's not always an easy thing to say, but I also think that a healthy relationship, they should be able to tolerate no's and they should be able to tolerate human limitations because we all have them.
Yeah.
um so I think that just being able to get some outside support, and I think maybe even as far as connecting as a couple, that I think sometimes conversations end up being a lot about just heavy things all the time. So I think even just like trying to even focus on staying connected, but maybe trying something a little bit lighter, like
Yeah.
having a game
Yeah.
night or, like doing something like those, there's like a bunch of like conversation starter question decks and things
Yeah.
like that, that it's like I want to value our communication, but I want to, and just based on where I'm at emotionally, like I need to keep it at this level so it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like you're disconnecting totally. So I guess those are a few things just off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
something that can be solved, unfortunately. But
Right. And I think too, in just in my own experience, and again, everybody's experience is different. So I just offer this as my own experience. But when I have gone through seasons of like when I was just really struggling with depression and kind of in the darkest season, I mean, my husband carried more of a load logistically than is normal. I mean, he
mhm.
does a lot around our house anyway. He's a great dad, does a lot with our family, but he was just doing like above and beyond what we would typically prefer in our home. And sort of as I started to come out of that season, it was really clear that like he had kind of been able to power through and God had sort of given him the strength to
Mhm.
power through. But when you've been powering through for a season, it's like you can't just suddenly go back to normal. It's like my counselor once told me,
Yeah.
she's like, I remember telling her, I'm like, why am I still so tired and feeling so overwhelmed when our outward life has changed? Like it's gotten better. And she's like, Sarah, it's like you just ran a marathon. You're tired at the end of the marathon,
Mhm.
right? Like it's not like you're automatically back at your normal energy level. And I think, for my husband, it's as I've come out of my own dark season, he has had to, we're starting even now to say, okay, well, how can you now get a little bit more of the rest you need because you've been
Mhm.
kind of powering through for the last 3 years. And now that I have a little bit more capacity than I did, a couple years ago, um, he's kind of coming down from all of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think sometimes in those seasons where maybe you're the primary kind of functioning person. And I don't say that in a belittling way. I mean that in like, you are the one that has to do all of the things primarily for whatever reason. I think as much as possible, if you do get to come out of a season of that, and I realize some of those seasons don't end for some people,
Mhm.
but being able to um, allow yourself to refill a little bit and to,
Yeah.
or even simply sometimes I think it can be acknowledging that it's normal and okay to be tired. Like, even for my
Mhm.
husband, like it's been a long 3 years, and for him to be able to acknowledge and to say that and to say, okay, like I gotta, I now I need to fill up a little bit because I am completely depleted.
Mhm.
And sometimes we're just in those really intense seasons, not able to fill up, or we're just like a, person who's just
Yeah,
thirsty
you're
and
on
kind of
survival. Yeah,
yes,
you're in
on
survival
survival
mode.
mode. But even hopefully as some of that capacity changes for the other person who has been struggling, um,
Mhm.
just to be able to acknowledge that it's still okay to be tired. You're recovering from whatever season it may have been, and to try to make some space to fill up in some way. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes
and if
sense.
you are the person who was struggling, I think also maintaining your support is so important because I think the first thing I thought is how it could be really easy to like sink back into like a spiral of shame of just like, oh my gosh, I was
Mm,
doing so poorly. Like, look how negatively this
yeah,
impacted the life of my spouse. And
yeah,
being able to hold that reality of when we are suffering, that other people get hurt in the process
yeah,
sometimes. And even if it's unintentional, but that can be a really, really hard thing
yeah,
to hold.
yeah,
And even just remembering that even when we are at our worst, that those are still there, those are only parts of us that
yeah,
are struggling, and it's not the whole of us, it's not everything that we are. But
yeah,
sometimes when we are really deep in a like a depressive cycle or really, really anxious, it can feel like that's all there is. Like,
yeah,
this is who I am, this is all I am, and that's all there is to it. But I was just thinking too, it's like that can be a hard thing to hold
yeah,
when you come out of that space, is hearing like, this has really impacted somebody else.
yeah.
And
I noticed that in this almost sounds like a silly example, but I noticed that. So we had a little book launch party on Sunday, with some friends and family, and I am a crier, and so I got all like teary
Mhm.
eyed, and later that night, my kids were like, "Mom, are you okay?" Like they couldn't, like
Mhm.
they were there, they saw me crying, and they have been very used to me being not okay,
Yeah.
up until the last year or so. I've been in a good place just mentally and emotionally for the last year, but even at their age, my son is 8 and my other son is 5. Both of them, and my daughter too is 8, they were just kind of trying to process me crying at my launch party, and
Mm.
I didn't even think about how they were, like, that didn't even cross my mind that they would
Yeah.
not necessarily realize that it was happy tears, that it
Mhm.
was like tears of gratefulness, and we had to kind of take some time and explain that to them because their experience of me crying has been very different,
Yeah.
for the
Mhm.
last couple years. And just even with my own kids, like realizing, and this has also brought on a lot of guilt, which is like a whole nother
Mhm.
conversation, and just like wrestling with God that, like just for feeling guilty that
Yeah.
my depression has caused so much heartache and grief for my husband and for my kids. And just acknowledging the effect that it's had on them, but then also saying, like God is still good and there is still grace. And,
Mhm.
I one, Susan Yates, who's a writer and speaker, she's a grandmother and has had a lot of experience parenting and grandmothering. And one of the things that she said when I listened to her speak one time was, your capacity to ruin your kids will never be as great as God's ability to redeem them.
Mm.
And that
Mhm.
has just kind of stuck with me as I've been wrestling with, just how my situation has affected my kids, but being able to have the grace and compassion for them and also for myself
Mhm.
in all of that. It's been a learning process for sure.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, and if it's any like consolation to you too, it's like what kids actually internalize is not always the bad things that happen, but those things being repaired. And so I think
Mm,
these conversations, you know,
that's
even that
good.
conversation that you're having with them to like walk them through what they've experienced and you being able to hold that for them, like that's so huge. And yeah, because I do think that they also will see like, okay, like I actually felt kind of scared about something and my
Yeah.
mom and dad kind of helped me through it and helped me to
Yeah.
understand it. And so yeah, so I think
That's
that
good.
that's huge, is that they internalize that sense of like, when things feel off in me, my parent helps me to like bring me back to
Mm.
baseline and like bring me back to calm and security. And that's what they internalize, not necessarily like the individual little mistakes, you know,
That's
that
really helpful and really encouraging because I think we sometimes see, okay, if I need to repair something, that's like a bad thing, but
mm-hmm.
it is really encouraging to hear like, okay, no, like that's a not
Yeah.
that the bad thing that happened is good, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
that cycle of needing to repair is okay
Yeah.
and good for our kids. That's
And
helpful.
I always think too, I think that there, I mean, I love all the movements toward like gentle parenting and attachment and all of those things, but sometimes I do think it puts a lot of pressure on
Mhm.
parents and especially moms to almost be like God to our
Yeah.
kids and to be
Yeah.
perfectly attached to them and attuned to them at all times. So I also think too, like part of the reason I think our kids get imperfect parents is that I want them to know that they need Jesus and that that's on me. Like,
Yeah.
so as even being the best parent we can be, like I think our limitations are intended to ask,
Yeah.
help them to ask like, oh, I wonder like what
Yeah.
else is out there, you know, because the truth is we're meant to be a representation of God's
Yeah.
like unending compassion and grace and goodness and safety. And we won't be those things all the time because we're
Yeah.
people, but there is some, but the hope would be like that would point to God who is, and that they
Yeah.
meet him.
That's good. That's good. All right, last question, and then I'll kind of give a couple just reminders and a couple other logistical things. But final question. Um, actually, no, I'm sorry, two more questions. What are
Okay.
just some helpful resources, either favorite books or um just
Yeah.
places that you would encourage people to go if they're struggling with some of these issues, whether it be depression, anxiety, grief, trauma,
Mhm.
any particular resources that you can
Yeah,
recommend?
I know you actually just, I think you mentioned her recently in one of your Instagram posts, but probably a couple of my favorite people in the field right now are two women therapists. So one is Allison Cook, and she's fantastic. She has a couple of books, one that she co-authored with another therapist that's called Boundaries for Your Soul.
Mm,
And then the other one is The Best of You. So if you are a, you know, a Christian woman who has wrestled with like people pleasing or,
yeah.
you know, trying to understand what do I do with the big emotions that I experience. And, you know, I think those are great resources. And then the second person would probably be Andi Kolber. So she's written two books. One is called Try Softer. I think you maybe started reading Strong Like Water. I
I
haven't
have,
read it
yeah.
yet.
I'm a couple chapters in
Um,
and I've like highlighted the whole thing.
but I've listened to a couple podcasts where she
Yeah.
talks about some of like the foundational concepts for the book. So I feel like knowing enough about what's in there, I think
Yeah.
there's some elements of that that would be super helpful. But if you, especially if you have experienced some sort of trauma or come from a dysfunctional family, those would be really, really good resources. So great books and podcast, and also like just people to follow.
Yeah.
And then I would say probably another person I really like is Adam Young, and he has a podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves. And he unpacks a lot of, you know, even a couple of things that I've talked about, but you know, what does it look like to really understand your own story and how it's
Mm,
impacted you, and being able to heal from that, parent out of that. You know, there's so many different categories that he covers. So those are a couple of my main go-to resources.
so helpful. All right, last question. You are also a writer as well as a therapist, and I'd just
Mhm.
love for you to tell people where can people find you or if they want to connect with you or read your work.
Yeah, for sure. So my website is just melissabrownback.com. I'm also on Instagram at Melissa Brownback. Like I said, I write in the margins, so I I am probably not the most consistent poster, but I do also try to, when I post, have it be something that is, you know, meaningful, authentic, and something that I really try to have be a resource
Yeah.
to others. So, but yeah, I love writing about, you know, my kind of main focus areas are things related to attachment and kind of understanding our story, and also understanding, especially small T trauma would probably be my specialty areas of things that I like to write about. And on my website too, I've been published at a couple places. So there's links to articles and some of the things I've written there.
Awesome.
So
Thank you so much, Melissa. This
yeah.
was super helpful. Guys, if you have not read through the appendix in All Who Are Weary, it is super helpful. When Melissa first sent me everything, I was like, this is just sort of the like 30,000 foot view of like therapy and counseling that I think is so helpful for people to understand, especially if they haven't haven't gone to therapy themselves, or it just feels like I don't know what this is or what I need. It is a really, really helpful resource. So thank you. And I also want to just say thank you to the launch team. If you're watching this later, we are recording this on April 4th, which is launch day for All Who Are Weary. So I'm just so grateful for everybody who is just sharing about the book and reading the book. And I really do not take that for granted. So I'm so, so thankful. Would love to see your posts on social media, and don't forget to post your reviews on Amazon and all the places. If you can request to purchase the book from your library, all that other good stuff. So anyway, thank you to everybody. And Melissa, thank you so much. This was
Yeah, thanks so much.
immensely helpful.
I'm so happy to even just get to talk to you because it's
I
been a while.
know it has been a while. Someday it'll be in person again, I hope.
I would love it.
So, all right. Thanks, friends.
All right.
All
Okay.
right. Bye.